When the news first broke that mommy influencer Ruby Frank was exposed for abusing her children, a lot of us thought we knew what kind of story that was. And it had the beats that we knew, some things that were very familiar to this kind of story. You have this shiny, happy blog with these blonde, somewhat affluent people. You've got the family of eight, just large enough to attract a big YouTube audience. And then you have the cracks of this kind of odd, somewhat fringe parenting that are just controversial enough to have chatter in the comments. And then you have these parenting styles that stoke that controversy a little bit more and a little bit more. You had the teaming up of the mom with the successful life coach and therapist and their expanding business. And then there was this increasing audience commentary that something was off about their relationship with each other. It seemed like if anything ever came out, it would be the kind of information we could guess just looking at them, that maybe the Frankie family was not as happy as they appeared to be. Maybe they had something hidden, some kind of hidden sin in their past that they did not want to share with their YouTube audience. Or perhaps that they were exploiting their children, which was kind of obvious to see because this was a mommy influencer or a family vlogging channel. And anyone could guess that perhaps their final, most grievous charge would be that they were exploiting their children without their consent for content creation. And even then, when Ruby Franke's son limped up to his neighbor's house on that 110-degree hot day in the desert, I still thought I knew what kind of story this was. But this is not a story about careless content creation, the kind of story that we're starting to see more of as the children of these vlogging channels are now growing up and taking their own story to their own platforms. It is not the plot of the American Murder series that Netflix puts out regularly, of a guy who wakes up one day and decides that his family is an inconvenience and they are no longer the kind of props he needs, and then he commits family annihilation. The latest documentary on this kind of true crime that Netflix has released, Evil Influencer, the Jodi Hildebrandt story, it asks the audience to think about how this story is also a Mormon one. It's a religious case that's informed by this very traumatic response to a kind of power structure in a particular form of American culture. It's a story about someone who gave themselves agency and total control for themselves at the expense of not just the Frankie children, but many other young, desperate families. It would be a mistake to see this case as simply an individual family that went off the rails because they got involved with a strange friend. And that is a story in itself worth processing. This is The Process with Alex Baytal. We're going to be looking at the Jodi Hildebrandt version of the story that is given to us by this particular documentary. And I'd also just like to say ahead of time, there are going to be some slight descriptions of child abuse. There is the discussion of the crimes that were committed against the Frankie children and some of the crimes that were committed against Jodi as a child. So Skye Borgman's documentary, it opens and closes with this ring-style footage of Ruby Franke's youngest son, shyly but bravely asking Jodi's neighbors for help getting to the police. As imperfect and shame-filled as it is, it's an act of agency and self-protection, and that's going to be a theme that comes up a lot throughout this story. Borgman is, of course, establishing something that you would have already heard about, which is the Frankie family's final fall from grace as the popular vlogging family channel. But the focus, however, is on the popular, beloved Utah therapist Jodi Hildebrandt herself and the mysterious role that she played in the unraveling of multiple Mormon families. And what we are led to as an audience is the other forms of shame and these attempts to have agency within a specific subculture that various people within the documentary take and how that leads to different outcomes. And when we listen to the various Mormon therapists, the Mormon law enforcement, these neighbors and these friends who grew up in this subculture, and when they start talking, some of the mystery about what actually went down falls away. And it does lead us to ask this question that we first asked when People magazine and these other outlets started covering the Frankie child abuse case in the first place, which is, who is Jodi Hildebrandt? Now, initially, Jodi Hildebrandt was seen as somewhat of an odd pair with Ruby, this overzealous therapist who became obsessed with the mommy blogger herself, and someone who saw and loved this 8 Passengers YouTube channel as a platform while hating the children that made it up. We, the public, of course, learned about the heinous abuse and its ending, how Ruby and Jodi were arrested on about 6 counts of aggravated child abuse charges. charges. And then they go off to prison where they take these plea deals and they plead guilty to 4 of those counts of aggravated child abuse. But what we didn't understand was the beginning. We learned that Jodi met the Franke family through her own very successful coaching business. What needs to be made clear is she did not need 8 passengers as a YouTube channel to get her big break. She already had that. She was the couples therapist, and then against ethical and professional guidelines, she starts counseling the children individually, and I believe Ruby and her husband individually as well. And then we watch as she starts this other kind of relationship with Ruby as her friend and professional partner. It's not a stretch to see how Jodi looked at the 8 passengers and the Ruby Franke family as something that could be leveraged. Yes, she was making $46,000 about a month just through her own individual therapy sessions. But Connections, her business, had a popular online base as well. And working together with Ruby meant that they could continue to expand both of their reach to families across more states. So couldn't this just be a story about a therapist crossing a lot of boundaries, overcommitting, and greed? But what we see when we look at this story is that there was always an opportunity underneath these alliances that Jodi would make with the Franke family or the other families that came into her care, or the Mormon community in general. Natasha Helfner, who was another professional therapist who ended up taking on a lot of the wrecked former clients of Jodi, would mention that this kind of motivation is key to understanding why Jodi operated the way that she did. She said it can sometimes be telling why someone becomes a therapist and why they choose to go into their particular place of practice. And the documentary does take time to speak to a range of people who have different facets and different experiences with Jodi and show what could have been Jodi's great obsession, which was families being rid of all sorts of kind of evil and finding a way to control male actions. Something intriguing about this documentary is you see the kind of young couple that was pushed towards Jodi. And these were young people that were struggling in their new marriages. They had been married very young as part of a lot of the LDS subculture. And they represent this demographic of her old client base that would kind of just hand over their marriage to Jodi in the first place. And yes, they have a different age range from what was going on with Ruby and Kevin Franke, but the pattern of manipulation was still very much the same. So what we see is these men who get caught up under Jodi's abusive practices. And then you have the women who think that Jodi is going to save these men. And Valerie and Ethan, 2 of these young people in different marriages, they, long after Jodi had been embroiled in this issue with a HIPAA violation of another young man from the Mormon community that made her ineligible to be a proper therapist, she was giving out marriage advice as if she was a therapist and billing these people as if she was a therapist. And her ideas that she was presenting to these young couples, they weren't actually considered all that fringe. Different, but not fully fringe. She ran her business off of being a bishop-recommended counselor for years, and her own personal experiences as a Mormon wife who went through divorce, and her understanding of the lack of agency that many Mormon women felt within their marriages, it provided this kind of trust to these people. And it helped these Mormon women who were coming to her with their issues feel for the first time empowered and seen, which allowed them to then trust her further. The language around her life coaching business Connections was all about compatible Mormon values that people would have already heard with a slight twist. So she had this emphasis on integrity, on the strength of the family culture and their health, and she was very keen on honesty, which is very ironic. Her branding was all about these hardcore protections for the sanctity of the family and making sure that someone's family structure had accountability. But in practice, there seemed to be such a harsh, shameful, and angry way for approaching and dealing with the men who were in front of her and the humanity and sexuality of the men that the wives were concerned about. And they were judged, they were confronted and humiliated in ways that made Jodi increasingly more powerful in these family dynamics, and then in charge of their thoughts, actions, and their access to women. That is key for understanding what comes later. The realization that she was being too harsh or toxic would always come just too late for many of the people who threw themselves into her programs. And it was only after they were in deep that they would start to question and fear her. And for some people, it was too late. Jodi was not out here freeing people from religious and social harm. She was merely harnessing it for the good of her business and her own sense of self and power. So how does she pull this off? Laura Howes-Levitz, Jodi's former missionary companion, showed her own personal mission journals from this period of time. And she was the one to point out that Jodi was always charismatic. Jodi's ability to persuade, move, and connect with people was even a point of jealousy for young Laura. This charisma that Laura speaks of, it doesn't waver for Jodi across her lifetime. Not after her divorce, not after having to pivot to life coaching because of that aforementioned HIPAA violation, and not after her arrest for torturing other people's children. Jodi's ability to get people to listen to her, to go to extreme measures to get their approval, and to trust her only grows in power over the years. This kind of detailed emotional journaling that Laura describes and literally brings to show in front of the camera, it's something that is part of the culture, Laura says. And the fact that she can even reference it all those decades later, it's also how Jodi's fate was sealed in the court of law. Because Ruby also kept these incredibly detailed journals of everything she and Jodi were doing to the children. The Mormons in the documentary say that this journaling aspect, it's a huge part of their culture, and that while the actions Ruby and Jodi were taking were definitely extreme, journaling the whole process and leaving this unintended trail for the police to follow, run of the mill. Laura is also the voice in this documentary that hints that Jodi had this deep satisfaction with her own marriage. And in following the steps to be a good Mormon, she had her own significant challenges. And she had this internal, personal battle with her own sexuality. That battle, Laura thinks, probably haunted Jodi for a long time, and that there was a lot of repression and silencing of her own self that has come out in various hidden, deceptive ways in the years since. And while we don't know the full relationship of her eventual relationship with Ruby, there's been a lot of speculation about that. Her older children have come forward to say that they were very close in person, that they would sometimes sleep in the same bed. And what the public could see was that they were very physically close and always promoting their business together in almost couple-like ways. Jodi's own past was very present in how she related to people and then would pull them into her circle. As a child, she had her own significant, horrible traumatic experiences with abuse at the hands of young men. And she had internalized a lot of that and stuffed it down because it was not part of her family culture to be able to talk about that openly. She would then internally be at war with her own sexuality and trauma for the rest of her life. She seemed to turn to control other people's families and husbands and men to get this sense of safety that she just didn't have as a child. Going back to Natasha Helfner, that Mormon therapist who took on a lot of her client load after everything happened with Jodi, or over the years as people would peel off from Jodi's influence, she reminds us that it's this Mormon culture that Jodi helped create in terms of working with the LDS to view and package a growing panic over the digitalization of explicit sexual materials online as a form of addiction. Now, there's a very necessary debate over the impact of these sexual scripts and these materials and the production of them and the ways that they have impact on people's relationships, our brains, and each other. But Jodi had this very extreme and detached way of labeling all men as addicts and dangerous to their family. And by labeling all these behaviors or curiosities in these men as blanket addiction and addictive, she could, under the cover of intervention and addict language, escalate her so-called treatment. Treatment that, I should add, was also not really being overseen by any other kind of governing body, because now at this point she's gone way off course. It took very little for her to encourage these no contact separations between the couples and their children. She would encourage the wives to surveil and control their husbands by shutting off the internet, canceling streaming services if even one movie on the streaming service might tempt their husband, or cut off certain access to kinds of money or anything that the wives could do to surveil and prevent their husbands from sinning. And she was not asking these men, critically, to reconsider their relationship to themselves, the media, or their wives. She was asking them to reorient their relationship in such a way that Jodi functioned as the head of the household and that she would tell the wife what to do. The documentary points out that Jodi wasn't empowering these people. She wasn't empowering the men. She wasn't empowering the women. She was more just setting herself up as a mini church-like figure to whom the women would switch their allegiance to. Now, the attorney on this case, who spoke to the film crew, Eric Clark, noted that Ruby Franke's behavior toward her children prior to Jodi's involvement was definitely fringe and strict, but it wasn't criminal. He also points out that the escalation of the treatment towards the children matches the escalation of the relationship with Ruby Franke and Jodi herself. When the prosecutors and Detective Jessica Bate were investigating, they saw that Ruby was, yes, fringe-like in her parenting, like we mentioned earlier, but she just didn't use these extreme methods until Jodi came onto the scene, and these were ideas that came from Jodi. What is believed about the worst of the abuse is that it follows after Jodi finds a way to move into the Franke house under the guise of having mental problems or these religious experiences that are very tough for her to handle alone. And then she further isolates Ruby by convincing her to go no contact with her husband Kevin for at least a year. Kevin moves out, and Jodi and Ruby continue this strange religious march that is culminating in Jodi seeing herself more and more like a prophet figure. They decided to get rid of the evil in the children. And yes, this has been something that they've been working on for months prior, but it escalates in that they believe that the devil has a hold of the kids, that the kids have demons, and now they have to take any action necessary to purge the children of this evil. And this is where the two younger kids find themselves routinely starved, denied shelter from the hot sun. You have to remember we're out in the desert here, where they were forced to lay for hours, tied up in various places in the house. There were physical punishments, like being forced to jump on a little exercise trampoline for hours on end with no breaks, or to be left alone in closets or little rooms while handcuffed. Ruby's oldest children, they were already estranged from her at this point, and Kevin, her husband, was believed by the state to credibly have no idea of what was actually going on, and that he didn't know that the children had been moved back and forth between Ruby's home and Jodi's mansion. Not surprising, Jodi's own two adult children are estranged from her and were estranged from her at the time as well. And this young teen, Jesse Hildebrandt, who was the child of one of Jodi's siblings, was a target for Jodi's abuse years prior. Except at that time, no one believed Jesse's statement when they went to the police. Jodi was able to spin this as if Jesse was just this troubled, dishonest teen, and people believed it. This is a pattern that Jodi would use to shame, disconnect, or break down husbands or other members of the family from each other. Both Valerie and Ethan, while taking responsibility for their own issues in their own marriages, easily conclude that Jodi's methods did not help and that it further ruined their marriages. Critically, neither of those people are with the original spouse that they started treatment with. And while law enforcement would determine that, yes, Ruby Franke on her own abused the children and allowed that abuse to happen, she was very eagerly wrapped up in Jodi's charisma. And this was a bond that when they were separated later in prison, the law enforcement could see was weakening. The irony is that for all of Jodi's insistence on the truth, this battle against distortions of reality, she went to great lengths to distort the facts and the truth of what had happened to law enforcement. The truth of her methods that she fully owned when talking to other people or talking to Ruby, she tried to distort in front of Detective Jessica Bate and other law enforcement. When her neighbor tearfully called the cops after speaking to this injured young Frankie boy, Jodi was frantic to find him before the cops did. The cops even ran into her, and they have footage of this in the documentary of her looking for the little boy before they could find him. When the cops came to her home, she was already on the phone with her lawyer. Jodi also protested and tried to keep law enforcement from entering her home. There's a saying on Dateline that good people ask who's coming to the house. And then there's a saying that criminal people tend to know exactly who is coming to the house, and Jodi was prepared. Jodi had hidden the handcuffs and some of the rope that had been used on the young children in this safe room that she then proceeded to pretend she did not know the code to or had never set up a code. Of course, the cops guessed the code and they're correct, and they find the items inside. She denied the homemade remedies that she had applied to the handcuff wounds on the young boy. She did not try to cooperate in her interviews, and she never, ever, even in her plea deals, admitted that what she did and the actions she took were wrong or abusive. She kept using this line that she would use when she was talking about her other clients, which is that she just wanted the best for these kids and she wanted them to lead good lives. In her recordings of these outgoing phone calls from prison, she leans hard into what she imagines God is telling her about this unjust imprisonment that she's going through and this distortion of the facts and how she is going to be used to miraculously and spiritually tell the gospel. We watch her pivot to anointing herself as an imprisoned missionary, something akin to St. Paul. What we're left with when this documentary ends is the sick realization that for all this talk about healing families and this desire to go into therapy, Jodi never healed on her own. Instead, she sought to put herself in the position of the church and the people who had abused her, or created the very context that had made her abuse silent. The Mormon and non-Mormon people alike in this documentary share in this idea that the crimes committed here were uniquely possible because of this religious and social context. Now, we know children are the most oppressed class in the world. They are vulnerable. They are dependent on adults. They are not fully developed, and they are often left from the beginning of their birth at the mercy of whoever they happen to be born to or who they are left in guardianship with. Child abuse, not unique. It happens world over. It happens to millions of kids every year. But what made this particular case possible for so long reflects the attitudes and the cultural norms that many of the victims and the perpetrators themselves had grown up with. This is how Kevin doesn't check in on his kids for over a year, but is still the kind of father that credibly breaks down and is believed by the police and people who witness him to be someone who is deeply broken up by what happened to his kids. He is the kind of father who was able and granted full custody of his kids afterwards. He had, with Jodi, a new religious authority figure that was going to dictate the configuration of his family. His Mormon background, it made it just that much easier. Ruby is incentivized and already conditioned by her background to keep her kids on the right path and protect this eternal family according to her Mormon tenets. She persecuted her own children in the name of God. Ethan and Valerie and countless other couples entrusted Jodi because she had been recommended by spiritual leaders like their bishops. Valerie at one point says, in Stress in the Haze of It All, she believed that Jodi was herself the voice of God, or a kind of voice of God. Jodi herself became this exact kind of evil influence, not with this primary agenda of looking to find kids to hurt, but as someone who was not going to ever be hurt again herself. She was never going to be in a relation configuration where she did not have ultimate power. And she was going to do what was typically left to male community members of this community she grew up in, which is the ability to surveil, lead, and enforce decisions. What is striking at the end of all of this is that normally this kind of religious abuse and harm and extremism, it's hidden, it's invisible. It doesn't have always this physical manifestation. And people coming out of being spiritually gaslit or from these abusive family dynamics where the harm is very mental, there's sometimes no actual physical evidence of what is being done in the home. It's also part of what makes children some of the most oppressed people in the world, because you can't always prove the emotional isolation that's happening to these kids. Shot after shot in this film, we see the religious abuse made visible, made clear. You see the saran wrap that was used to wrap around the children's wrist after they'd been handcuffed for hours and days on end. There were the actual restraints of the rope, the handcuffs themselves, hidden away in different parts of the house. You had the imprints in the concrete from the trampoline, the calcium buildup on the trampoline net itself of the children's sweat. These artifacts of control and harm were undeniable to law enforcement. And then the wider community who might have liked to spin this off as simply the folly of two. Jodi Hildebrandt is, yes, responsible for her choices. So is Ruby Franke. But she had a pattern to her movements, the kind of pattern we're taught not to see in some of our religious communities. The kind of pattern recognition that is dangerous to the power or individuals who seek to control others who are prey because of their cultural conditioning. The kind of pattern recognition that men don't want young women to have when they are out in the dating pool. When we were discussing the Knives Out franchise, which is the fictional mystery series that's on Netflix, we looked at how the actual crime itself, usually by the time you get to the end of the movie, it's not that hard to describe or understand. It's the people who commit the crime and why they do that that proves to be much more difficult in the first jump, and that's actually the real meat of the mystery. It's in looking back and realizing who they are and what made or shaped them that the motivations and the impulses sometimes seem now obvious. And I know when we started talking about this, we said, yeah, this is not like the family annihilation cases that American Murder really trades on. Also, no downplaying the unique losses that those family annihilation cases have. Because yes, we could say, oh, they're all really similar, but the loss of those victims to themselves and to their communities, that's a whole world. The temptation with stories like the ones we see in American Murder, or when we're talking about the difference between this case and another case, is that we can look at that and go, oh yeah, this is just a random guy who one day snaps and offed his whole family. And we could connect that to the national data about how it's a certain kind of person who does that, and it breaks down on a gendered violence level, and there's a pattern to how those murders are committed. These men, even within the pattern, they're presented as uniquely crazy, but they're ultimately people who were always selfish and thought of their families as mere objects that were there to make them look good. They're not complicated villains whose depths actually need to be sympathetically plumbed. I started this out by talking about how Jodi represents a different kind of story. That evil influencer as a show represents a specific religious and social texture to it. But also, I find myself wrapping up this rundown of this story, realizing that Jodi is just another person using the preconditioned cultural messaging of whatever masses she finds herself in front of to puff herself up or get something out of. She was a skilled communicator who used the community she claimed to serve to run from her real self and the real work. And she did it in the name of healing people. The irony is that it's not about healing. It wasn't about healing. It was about creating new cycles of old abuse. I think one of the patterns we have to face at the end of true crime documentaries like this one are just how many of these stories end so badly because one person in the relationship did not see the relationship the same way. You have these victims who enter these relationships looking for human connection. And then you have these abusers who look at these human relationships as ways to control how people see them or how they see themselves. They look for their families or these congregations or friends or children to soothe something inside of them. And when they can't do that, they cruelly discard them. Now, when I think about Chris Watts and his plan to just move on to a new relationship and delete his whole family, I don't see a madman. And neither would Professor Elizabeth Yardley. She says that we have these kind of criminals all wrong. They don't snap. They don't change. They were always the kind of cold people who could do this. These acts of abuse are when they near the end of whatever moves they think they have left, and when the people that they are hurting or keeping around stop being useful. People don't just snap on their kids. They already have to have a level of disrespect and a lack of humanity for those children. People don't just get rid of a whole family that they love. They are objects to make them look good. Props, Professor Yardley says in a very specific story that the abuser is telling. And if that story changes or ends for any reason, those props can be reevaluated. Jodi Hildebrandt was an evil influence for sure, but she was successful in getting Ruby Franke because of how Ruby already viewed her family. She was successful at infiltrating many Mormon families because of how controlled the family as a system was to a pre-existing Mormon social order. And Jodi herself was shaped by the very culture of silence and control that she would one day manipulate for her own gain. I think at the end of these crime stories, there's a sense that yes, the criminals are less mysterious to us now. We kind of understand their motivations. Beyond the headline, we finally see them. But what is deeply unsettling is that we also see ourselves and the culture that not only helped make them, but had us fail to spot them in the first place. That's the process for now. I'll see you next week and let me know what you think.